Tonight, we're going to focus primarily on the National Security Garden. If there's time, we do have some slides of some other projects, and we'd be happy to show those to you. We've decided to focus on the National Security Garden because by introducing you to that project, we also introduce you to the way that we work, which is collaboratively. Also, we introduce you to what we see as sort of our evolving collaborative strategies to be interdisciplinary, also to work at the intersection of art and science, art and technology, but to stay focused on the social while doing that, and to work interdisciplinarily. And so those will be the things that we focus on. I'll just give you the opening image here is fairly self-explanatory, except that the color that you see of those leaves is indeed the color that we will get from the soybeans when we light them up, and we'll show you that a little later. This was the postcard that we used for the project in Zingen. To give you an overview of the components of the National Security Garden as it was installed in Zingen, Fabian has done this nice exploded view for us. We had a planter box built. We were able to design the project and work with hand workers in Germany that worked for the city to get it built. There's a box, and then we had about, how many? We must have had around 500 soy plants in the end.
I think 600 to 800, I think, 800. Yes.
When we planted seeds, we were going to go anywhere to 1,000. So about 600 to 800 soybean plants planted in the box. And in between the rows, we chose a kind of a row style, a more field agricultural style. In between those rows, LEDs that that were made by us to have a 3:2 ratio of red to blue LEDs so that we would get a nice magenta color, and we'll explain later why it needed to be that specific relationship. And the other important component of this project was the solar tower that stood next to the soybean field and should be considered really part of the project as a sculptural element. We worked with a local company in Zingen to figure out how big the solar panel should be. To our surprise, quite large. And installed a battery here in the bottom, and the LEDs could be powered through the energy that we collected from the solar tower during the day, and that worked just fabulously. And to give you an idea of the situation, so here is how it looked installed. You saw how we imagined it. This is in front of the city hall. It was a place that many people walked by and rode by and drove by on their way into town or on their way to work. So we were in a nice location in terms of getting people just walking by, and the usual location had changed quite a bit. And the solar tower, one of those nice accidents that can happen. You don't plan for these things, but you sometimes get lucky. If you notice that we wanted to make sure that the tower had a certain lightness to it, we didn't want it to be a very heavy kind of element in the space. And so we chose to put these kind of zigzag boards in there. And if you notice, it sort of speaks very well to the Fachwerkhaus, the half-timber house across from the soybean field. And that's just something that was a really nice accident. You could kind of look through it and see this relationship. So that would be the day view. And then about sundown, we would try to have the LEDs come on. This is the night view. When the plants were little, the light spilled out of the box and would light up the buildings around it. As they got bigger, it was really concentrated on the plants themselves. And this mountain that you see in the background, this is a Hegau. This is a volcanic formation there, former volcano. And it's a very prominent feature on the landscape in that area. People recognize it from all over that region. And so it was also nice to be able to have that involved. To give you a little an idea of the total situation, the rectangular building you see in the background is the city hall. And so this is a public center. And so we were able to do a kind of intervention that was a public space. Planter boxes are something that are known in that city, but not in that space. And so people would be a little interested in taking a look at what this planter box was up to. And people walked by, and I think we had several guesses. The one that was the farthest off, but we had it a couple of times, is they wanted to know if we were growing marijuana. No, not. And then the second guesses were beans, but nobody really knew what a soybean was, and that was exactly one of the reasons for putting it there, is what are these things, why are they here? These soybeans are actually grown in a few locations in southern Germany, but nobody knows them as a plant. And so we tried to choose a location that had those qualities that we talked about. People would be passing by frequently. It was clearly in a public space that we had a public intervention. And it is also in a space, maybe Fabian can say a little bit more about the here and da, or I don't know whether you wanted to talk about that quickly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, more specifically in the context of a public artwork in Singen, there's this history of exhibitions in public space, and that started probably with a very big exhibition in the year 2000 called Hier, Da und Dort, here, there, and over there. And that was really a major event for the whole region. Singen is in the southern part of Germany. It's a town approximately with 50,000 inhabitants. It's very industrially kind of coined, has industrial history. And so seeing work in public spaces in Singen, artwork specifically, is still something new, but in 2000, this new development started, and they invited artists such as Joseph Kosuth, for example, the Kabakovs, to do art pieces there in public space. In fact, if you look under the soffit of the Rathaus of the City Hall, there's neon letters that spell out city names, town names. They're turned off during the day and then they turn on at night. That's a project from Joseph Kosuth that connects, so to say, that space, specifically the center of the city with the Rathaus, with the City Hall, to a larger global context. And so that's also one of the reasons why we chose this as a site for our project, because the idea of the National Security Garden is one that we think is not only, it comes from a very local context, but it has very global consequences, or a network of interrelated global issues revolving around that very innocently looking plant of the soybean. And so by placing it into that context, we also place it into the context of a representational building in a public setting, a town square, a public square that can be used for representational demonstrations, so to say, the idea of formal gardens that we try to address with our piece. So we started out with this idea of creating something that is a hybrid somewhere between a formal garden, very much inspired by the formal gardens of the 17th and 18th century, and an agricultural field that at a first glance don't really have too much to do with each other, but that are both, so to say, expressions of a certain kind of an ideology of representation, of power, of, so to say, the power of a ruling class with the representational gardens, but then also issues of power when it comes to industrial power, when it comes to monetary power in the agricultural context with the field. And so both of these, so to say, clashed or were combined in this, as we call it, discursive object of the National Security Garden in front of the City Hall.
I think the other thing that's maybe important to mention here is that it's a temporary installation. It runs until October, but I think that's something that we have had lots of conversation about. We'd be interested in talking with you about, but in research that I've done previously and then in projects that we've worked on, we find that when you work in a temporary mode, you can do things that you might not get to do if it's a permanent installation. And I think that there's something very powerful about an intervention that changes a space for in a very visible, and sometimes this is, I'm not sure I would call this radical, but sometimes in a more radical way, and then you can leave again. And as a strategy, it allows us to get people to take risks that they wouldn't normally take. If you were saying that this is going to be here permanently, then people feel that it has to be something that they can live with for the rest of their lives. Whereas with a temporary installation, you can have that kind of intense conversation and change, and then it goes away physically, but hopefully not ideologically. Okay, do you want to do the...
Let's continue with these guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Fabian talked about the way that this project comes from a very local context, but it has a very global kind of meaning for us, or we think that it has global reach. And so we wanted to just show you a little bit of that context. How many people have been to Indiana or come from Indiana? I've got a couple, okay. So this may be familiar to you. I came from California. It was not familiar to me, even though I came from an agricultural region. And I think that is the same for Fabian. We had these conversations as we were moving from Pittsburgh to Indiana. What is that? What is that? And so what you see are many fields like this. This is an interesting new development. Wind technology is becoming, wind energy is becoming very important to Indiana, and you're starting to see these windmills in the fields. And so now you're having conversations that are directly about energy and food right there together. I'll go through these more quickly. So just to give you, this is what the plants, when they're perfect, this is what they look like. You got a sense of what they really look like if you look at the three that are in the gallery. You know, they're eaten by bugs. They don't have this very beautiful shape. I mean, they grow crooked and all kinds of things. But then the larger context, I just want to give you a couple of quick slides to give you the larger context. So I don't know what you would have guessed. This is not what I would have guessed originally, but 30% of the US crops area in the US are planted in soybeans, followed, or that's second to corn. So that's how important they really are. And I think that US is one of the leading producers of soybeans, not for export, but for our own use. And I think we'll see that next. With world soybean production, we lead with production, 35%. Close behind us is Brazil. If you take South America together, then they are producing even more soybeans, which is an important part of the conversation in Germany. Most of the soy that comes to Germany comes from South America. Those are also GMO, largely GMO soybeans, as they are in the United States. But they export more than we do. So again, you can see how significant the soybean is, even though it's very insignificant, I think, in the cultural imaginary. You know, you have all kinds of ideas about corn and stories related to corn and the importance of corn, but not the soybean, at least in our experience talking to people. I don't know that people have stories about the soybeans the way they might about corn, right? Yeah, and so, but the soybean has been an important part of the US for quite a long time. They were introduced very early on, at least as early as the 19th century, if not a little bit earlier than that, and with a number of varieties in the beginning coming from Asia. And they caught the imagination of Henry Ford, and I'm going to let Fabian tell the Henry Ford story, because he likes the Henry Ford story.
Well, it's this guy with the big sledgehammer demolishing his own car, but that didn't break down in a kind of a demonstration to show how damage-proof a plastic car body can be. And in fact, the plastic that he used for this car, in a very experimental car in the late 1930s, early 1940s, had ingredients of soybean plants. And it was a larger demonstration of the concept of a cottage industry, as he called it, that with the sort of say agricultural utopia to grow car parts or machine parts on the farm, so that there's a direct connection between the crops that you grow on the farm, the processing of these crops, turning them into industrial materials, and then creating the machines that are then used again to grow more crops. Henry Ford at the time also presented this idea of the cottage industry during world fairs with the cars, with sort of say a model plant that you introduced, or a model barn at the time, but then also soybean inspired meals that are based off soybeans, edamame, soy milk, soy ice cream, all the way to a complete 15-course meal that was purely based on soybeans. So it was kind of a full circle approach to the soybean to create an agricultural utopia that unfortunately, due to the entry of the United States into Second World War and then Henry Ford's death in the 1940s, kind of vanished and is really little known to this day. But that's another use of, since Shannon addressed, where do we find soybeans, or how are soybeans being used? They're being used for feed, they're being used for energy, biofuels, for example, but they're also used for plastic, for paints, explosives even. If you are lucky and you can grab an invitation card for our exhibition here at Elon, that's actually printed with soy-based ink. So we also try to incorporate this concept of the different products that you find actual soy products in some of the visual artifacts in our work and for this exhibition. So there's a multitude of different uses where we find soy products, but they're just not very visible.
You want me to address this one?
Yeah.
And so maybe it's a stark contrast going from the sort of utopic view of Ford, or what we take to be a utopic view. I don't think he took it to be utopic. I think he thought that it would be something very practical. But at this point in time, it looks more utopic than it did then. But another important slide for the context of the project is the projections for the world population in 2050. This year, 2050, is becoming an important year that researchers are focusing on, particularly at universities like Purdue that have strong agricultural programs and research programs around food production, because that is the projected year in which it seems that we won't be able to produce enough food to feed people. It's not that we're not feeding everyone now, but we would have enough food to feed everyone should we figure out a way to do it. But the projections are that by 2050, we won't be able to feed everyone. And that's will start to take us into the title of the project, National Security Garden, because as food production becomes an issue, then food security becomes an issue, and that means national security becomes an issue directly related to food. And maybe the anecdote to tell here is that I was doing research for the project, and I came across an article that mentioned that the UN had briefly considered creating a green helmet unit. And that green helmet unit, instead of the blue helmet unit, would have the specific focus of food security, of trying to deal with the conflicts that everyone projects will happen around food shortages. And so if the UN is starting to figure out how do we address what we think will happen, then it's certainly becoming a very serious issue. And we can see that research foundations are starting to focus on that. So this is in I don't remember what year. I want to say it's been 2 to 3 years ago that the Pew Foundation got together with scientists and military experts. I mean, this is always an interesting combination, to do a project on national security, energy, and climate. And the idea was that given climate change, energy is going to be an issue, so how can the military make sure that they have enough energy to do their jobs, and what are going to be the conflict points related to that? And so the military focus and the military imagery is not far off. This is not made up. This image, this comes from Farm Futures, and we have at Purdue University, or not at the university library, at the local library, there are these carts where they have discard magazines. And of course, we are a strong agricultural school, and so we rifle through those every once in a while. And we came across this stack of Farm Futures magazines, and I just went nuts, because they're like, oh, we have to take these, look at these images, they're so amazing. And they're really great for understanding what are the issues that face farmers, but they're also really great places to think about how do we conceptualize nature and technology? How does that affect the way that we do agriculture and think about food? And so this one, the conflict is truly really about the fight between farmers trying to use land and allocate land for crops, right? And there's a really nice image coming up that Fabian will talk about. But this idea that you're willing to not only till your land, but protect your land is an arresting image. And I think that rhetoric of advertising, even if it's meant to be very provocative, it tells us something important about what we're willing to do, I think. So.
Yeah, so this was in the same magazine. It's actually the little soybean soldier that comes directly from the field. The issue, as Shannon said, was really the redistribution of land and for what purpose crops are being grown on certain kind of plots of land. Here specifically the soybean as a commodity crop. And the issue was, do we grow, as a farmer, do we grow these plants more for feed, or do we grow them more for energy and biofuel? And at the time, the industry paid more for biofuel, so there was a decrease in land use for feed, which also resulted in a host of different other problems that emerged. This was from a year ago, and it became even more pressing this summer with the drought in the Midwest, that globally, even all the way to Germany, when we were in Germany, there was a discussion between what was called in Germany Tank or Teller. Tank or Teller, so that means your car's tank or the plate that you have on the dinner table. So what do you grow the food for? And that, I think, foreshadowed already a year ago this kind of development. But then another context in which to see these technological interventions in nature is certainly represented in agricultural advertisement, as we see it, for example, in Farm Futures, but as you can also see it on the internet if you go to the company's websites. Syngenta, for example, BASF, Monsanto, for example, are some of the big biotech companies and firms that produce seed and pesticides that go hand in hand. But for us, also interestingly, a very interesting connection or reference to Leo Marx and the idea of the machine in the garden, that already, looking back at a very pastoral time in the American agricultural development, so to say, foreshadowed the intersection of nature and the machine, which was symbolized in that case by the train that entered the tranquility of the pastoral landscape, and that brought with it a host of different issues that Leo Marx addressed in his book. So these are, so to say, the contemporary machines in the garden for us that were made quite visible now through these advertisements, but that are in fact quite invisible if you go to the field, and you obviously don't see these robotic arms, but they're, so to say, metaphors for biotechnological interventions in the fields, herbicides, pesticides, but also GMO plants that you find in the fields. Did you want to add something to that?
We can go on.
Okay.
I can talk about Leo Marx for a long time. So.
Yeah. It's man versus wheat. Okay.
It's okay to laugh. We think they're funny too.
Yes.
And it's man versus weed, I suppose, is the way that you should read this year went all season long. And there's something there's also something about gender going on here, clearly, because we haven't seen any women, and you won't see any women in these particular ads. You will see them in some of the other ads, and those could be analyzed differently. But it's this idea, I think that it's an ongoing conversation in the US about the relationship between nature and technology, and understanding what is the human's role in that relationship. And do we consider humans to be part of nature, or do we not consider humans to be part of nature? And how do we define a weed? Man versus weed has this idea of there's good nature and there's bad nature, and we can tell the difference always, and we can eliminate it. And I'm not saying that I don't pull weeds in my garden, but I am saying that I'm the one who determines which one is the weed and which one, what's going to go and what's going to stay. But the stakes are really high when it comes to crops, because this is an advertisement, of course, for Capreno, which is a kind of pesticide that even, I think I want to point out that it says defeats even glyphosate-resistant weeds. Glyphosate-resistant weeds. Those then are the weeds that have gotten smarter than Monsanto's Roundup-ready soybeans. So now there are weeds that you can spray Roundup on and they're not going to die. And so these are the new chemicals that are supposed to help that. Do you want to?
Oh, you had a pretty good entrance to that one.
I had a good entrance. We play this back and forth sort of thing. So I think, again, what we're showing you through these advertisements are different American ideas of nature and our relationship to it, and how we relate to it. So this is a farmer who says, the good Lord has just made us caretaker of the land. You don't really own it. And I think this is an important quote because, of course, religion, Christianity has within the Bible certain ideas of how you can relate to the land, and I think we see them in rhetoric like this in the way that some farmers understand their relationship to the land. So on the one hand, the good steward, that I'm supposed to take care of nature. At the same time, we just saw the image before that says man versus weed, so apparently we can be selective about that. At the same time, you get images like this, where you're more playing, if you will, you're playing God, I guess, in deciding what you're going to wipe out. So the count on required cue to zap the gaps, and so.
Which is very interesting because that's exactly the same company that had the good steward of the earth before.
Yeah.
So DuPont kind of going back and forth between these two seemingly conflicting images of the farmer in charge of their fields.
So, and then we just had a few slides, maybe just about the growth stages of the soybean and what a soybean plant looks like. I guess maybe the reason to show you all these is because there are soybeans coming to your campus soon. And so this is what you may see or may not see if you're involved. And so we just wanted to give you a quick tour of Soybean 101. Do you want to?
Yeah, this is in the very early stage of the soybean development. Actually, the plants at the stage when we transplanted them in the garden in Germany that we created, because we had to plant them in a different location first, and then we were not able until May actually to arrive on site and basically install the work, and then had to transplant the plants already in a developmental stage that was a month into the growing stage, to be able to stay on track with the harvest and all the different activities around the project. So what you see here, this is approximately after a month after being put into the ground, after the seed has been put into the ground. You see the roots, and you see these little, they're called root nodules that are actually in a symbiotic relationship with the soybean plant, allowing the plant to gather nitrogen from the ground and turning it into energy for the plant. These nodules basically have to be cultivated, and the soybeans have to be what's called inoculated in the beginning with a powder that contains the bacteria that goes into the ground and then settles in the root system after the soybean starts to grow. Here we see the plants immediately after they have been transplanted into the National Security Garden, the good care that they received from the technical services in the city of Singen. That was very nice about that project, that, so to say, the whole city was involved in the creation of the project, the development, the building of the project, but then also the maintenance of the project. The city still has lots of technical services that work directly with City Hall, from the carpenters to the electricians to the gardeners to printing services that are all in-house, that were all on board with this project, printing invitation cards, now printing kind of a multiple leaflet for the finishing of the project, and then also taking care of the plants, watering them during the summer, and also harvesting the plants for us. This was a growth stage roughly, let's say 2.5, 3 months after the plants were planted, where we see the green soybeans develop on the plant. This is actually the stage where you can already have the first harvest of the beans and cook them, boil them in salty water, and then enjoy them as a tasty snack called edamame. You've probably encountered this in the Japanese cuisine as kind of hors d'oeuvres before you enjoy your sushi main course. But that's something that comes directly from the soybean plant. And here's another close-up shot of the pods that were growing in the summer. And then in early September, mid-September, we had the same pods, but in a kind of a dried-up condition with the actual seeds in there. And for us, conceptually, that also marked the end point of the project in Germany, that you grow these plants, you produce seed for a new generation of the project. This seed is going to be distributed next week. Unfortunately, only I get to travel to Germany. Shannon has to go back to teaching at the university. I'm so lucky to be on sabbatical, so I can take this little trip back to Germany and then distribute the seed back to the population in Singen, in that small town. So the idea is that then this plants the new seed in a quite applied way, hands-on way, but also in a conceptual way for the next generation of the project. So the project continues in a distributed fashion in the backyards of the people of Singen in the next year when they plant the next generation of soybeans. Do you want to talk about the light? Okay. So then let's continue, since we talked about the growth stages of the soybean plant. An important part of the installation in Singen was also our light concept, the lighting concept for the installation, which came from growth-supporting LED illumination that we find in grow houses, in research institutions such as Purdue University, for example. In this picture, we see Professor Burkhard Schulz, a colleague of ours at Purdue in the horticulture department, who was so kind to give a tour to our students in the Images of Nature seminar, and also stopped in this one research area where he illustrated just recently initiated project that investigates the proper wavelength for an optimized plant growth. And so what the scientists found out there was that if you use red LEDs and blue LEDs together in a very specific ratio, you can stimulate the plant growth and, so to say, supplement the lighting conditions if, for example, you don't have enough sunshine around for the plant growth.
And it's energy efficient, right?
And it's very energy efficient, much more so than fluorescent light that is commonly used in greenhouses, for example, because LEDs consume just a fraction of the actual power that is needed to even drive incandescent light bulbs or fluorescent lights, for example. So we used this as an inspiration for our project as well, again, in a very hands-on way, that the use of this light concept would actually stimulate growth, that it also aesthetically would transform the soybean plant into something that looks very artificial at night. And so that's an actual image of what the soybean plants in Singen looked like at night. If you remember the very first slide with the invitation card for that project, where we photoshopped the magenta color, we were amazed ourselves that we could almost truly 100% recreate this in reality with the addition of the LED lighting strips in the field. And so if you zoom out a little bit more, you see the plants that were illuminated from underneath, if you remember one of the earlier slides with the LED strips being embedded in the planter and then the plants growing, so to say, on top of them. So we're able to contain the light just to the square of the field and turn the plants into their negative image. So you had the green plants during the day, and then you have the negative or complementary color in the RGB color spectrum with magenta at night. So there was a very nice aesthetic spin to this light concept, as well as there was also a very practical idea of stimulating plant growth. And then conceptually, if we added this layer, the light became a metaphor for us also specifically for the technological intervention in nature in such a way that plants also at night specifically need some time to basically rest, where they don't need any light, where they basically need the darkness. With this concept, we could illuminate the plants, so to say, 24 hours, 24/7. And so even though we introduced a technology that could potentially have the plants benefit from that technology, it could also cause some damage in the field, especially if the plants don't have that time of recovery at night without any light. And so we feel the same way about many of the technological interventions in nature that are probably developed with a very good cause in mind, but that there's this shifting line in the sand that if you don't control or constantly put these technologies under scrutiny, you may even cause more damage than you create good with these interventions. And this brings us actually to this overview slide that's quite complicated and is also in German. It's going to test your German knowledge. Yes. But that's very interesting. So this was a network that we brought into discussion in Germany because we wanted to have a very public discourse and discussion revolving around the project. And we also listened very well and carefully to what the people had to say in Germany and then added on certain kind of notes to this developing network of different issues, aspects of contemporary concern, so to say, all revolving about the soybean in the center of this network. And that's something that we're specifically interested in also by networking these projects to other sites, to different sites. Hopefully now in a new project at Elon in the spring, but also through a new project that we're planning right now for Purdue University in our home institution, and to have the comparison, so to say. So what is some of the feedback that we get here in North Carolina compared to what we hear at Purdue, compared to what we hear in Germany, for example, and then hopefully some other versions in different parts of the country or internationally will complement the picture. Because even though there's some overlapping concerns and overlapping aspects that all people, so to say, talk about, there's some very region-specific differences as well, which was quite interesting for us to see. Because we came with this very American perspective to Germany, and even though my cultural background lies in Germany, I come from this region, I was still very surprised that some of the concerns were actually quite different than what we expected or what we brought into the discussion, for example. And so what were some of the means or some of the strategies that we used to solicit some of that feedback? We had quite a few public events scheduled around the installation. We had a public opening, obviously. We also had scheduled times where we were present at the site and just talked to passersby and visitors that came. We had, this is, for example, an image of the opening. And you see the person on the bicycle in the front, for example, just rode by, didn't even know what was going on, but then became interested in the project and stayed actually for quite a while and started discussion with the people that were there. And here in the center of the image, you see actually one of the people we specifically invited also for a discussion round, a more formal discussion round in the local art museum. This is Dr. Gruber from the University of Hohenheim, which is also has an agricultural research unit. It's in the Stuttgart region of Germany, that lectured on the, so to say, the cultural perception of soybeans, soybean growing and soybean development, but also the actual hands-on production of soybeans in Germany, especially in the southern part of Germany. And that's what we see in the next slide here. This was actually an image of is an image of the discussion round in the local art museum. We also had Frank Thorsten Moll on board in the blue t-shirt here, who's the director of the art collection of the Zeppelin Museum in southern Germany. And that's one of the major institutions in Germany that combines art and technology in their collection. So they have a technology collection, but they also have an art collection, and then create very interesting relations and interactions between these two collections. And so Frank Thorsten placed a little bit this idea of technology into a cultural context, since we talk a lot about technology and technological interventions in nature and in our cultural environment. We had Sabine Himmelsbach, part of that discussion, who is the director for the House of Electronic Arts in Basel in Switzerland. And then another one of Frau Gruber's colleagues, or Dr. Gruber's colleague, Dr. Hilger, also from the University of Hohenheim in Stuttgart, who talked more about international perspectives in soybean production, specifically social consequences of soybean productions in South America. So it was a very nice and well-rounded discussion, which constituted one more strategy for an open dialogue, a public dialogue. You also see that this was a public event, and so we solicited some comments, or tried to solicit some comments also through the discussion and some of the statements that the discussants made. We also talked to some high school students in technology-related disciplines, in art-related disciplines in the local high school. So it was a nice mix of trying to involve a larger public in the discussion in Germany as well. And we hope to... Oh,
I just wanted to say maybe to sum up. So I think that the main point is, so hitting on, Fabian was hitting again that this is a strategy, is that when we say that we're trying to create work that is discursive art, or that has a discursive element, or is evocative artwork in the sense that's used for design sometimes, or critical design, is that we're very interested in using the artwork as a place that people can come together and have conversations that they might not otherwise have. And that art becomes, I think it's important to say why art, because we could just have a symposium, right? So I'm a sociologist, I could write a paper and I could present it at a conference, but I choose not to. And we choose to work together to do it this way. And so I think addressing that question, I think art can contribute something that other disciplines can't, but we can use it as a way to bring together multiple disciplines to have that conversation. I think the garden in that space is something that people can relate to, that they can have questions about, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their disciplinary perspective, regardless of their social status even. So, I mean, we had people coming through who probably would never go into a gallery. So it's also important, I think, in this respect, that it was outdoors. They would never go into a gallery, but they didn't have a problem in their own city space coming up and asking us, hey, what are you doing? And to feel like they had the right to interrogate us to a certain degree. And so I think that was a very important learning process for us. We said we wanted to be in front of this garden. We said we wanted to answer questions, and then we had to do it. And we had to have some very interesting conversations. And sometimes challenging conversations, trying to figure out where was the relationship. But every time we had a conversation, we learned something. Sometimes I was quite challenged because people were speaking in the local dialect, and I have no problem with German, but the dialect was I was going crazy, trying to, really communicate. But we try to do it in multiple forms. So it's not just at the garden, but then let's also bring together, let's have conversation at different levels. Let's give the public or whoever we can invite in and feel comfortable coming in a group of experts, but not any group of experts. Let's try and have that interdisciplinary dialogue. Let's have artists and scientists talking to each other and answering questions from the public. So some of these faculty members, the plant scientists, they don't usually go out into a city space and talk to people about what they do. They're very well versed in what they do and can answer questions, but they don't usually do it in that form. And then to have, as Fabian was trying to point out, artists or people who are art historians and scientists trying to look at the same project so that we can see it from multiple views is something that we were trying to craft. I mean, that is really also part of the project for us. It takes a lot of time to get people to come together and to talk and to find a space, but we feel that I think that that's really part of the project and has developed through other projects. I don't know whether you would add anything about the why art strategy from your perspective.
Well, I think an interesting discussion that we've just started to have was initiated by a text that we wrote for a magazine or journal in Germany. In Berlin, it's called Plurale, a magazine for versions of thinking, which has a very interdisciplinary approach also to the types of submissions that they're soliciting. And so one of the editors of this magazine saw that project and invited us to write something about the project, since the latest issue is about art and science intersections. And she brought up an interesting point saying, well, it looks to me that this project tries to provide a very neutral way or neutral entrance point to all these very highly charged issues. So you don't really try to take any sides or try to claim that there's a right way to approach this or a wrong way or something that you should absolutely avoid or something that you dismiss from the beginning, which to her seemed to be quite the contrary to what she's used to scientific claims that basically have to be on the fence for what they try to prove or what they try to demonstrate. And so I think art has this very privileged role of being in a space where you can solicit quite a few different viewpoints without necessarily dismissing them right up front. And that's really what we try to do with our work as well, is to create these discussions, create this dialogue that then hopefully brings us to a point where we see things differently or where we get a different perspective on some of these issues that we try to bring to the table.
Great, yeah, we can talk more about that in questions. So that brings us to Elon, I suppose, and having just talked about the conversations we have had, I think we're looking to figure out the best way to continue the conversations here. And part of that is collaborating then with Samantha's class and figuring out how to bring the garden here. And we've already had conversations today about what could happen around the garden, what kinds of things could happen during the time that it's there.
I don't know, we can almost
stop
here, and
okay.
then because we've already talked.